The little girl stared at the single dad's untouched dinner as if that plate held the one thing she had been trying not to ask for all day. Her mother noticed her eyes, gently pulled her closer, and turned toward the restaurant door, pretending they had never come inside. But before they could leave, the single dad looked up from his table and saw the little girl wipe her lips with the sleeve of her worn pink sweater. He knew that look. It was the look of a child trying to convince herself she wasn't hungry. He had only ordered dinner because his 8-year-old daughter was staying with her grandmother that night, and for the first time in weeks, he had a quiet evening to himself. But as he watched the mother reach for the door, he suddenly pushed his chair back. Something inside him refused to let them walk away like that. He didn't know their names. He didn't know what had happened to them. He only knew that a little girl had been staring at his food, and somehow, that small moment was about to change 3 lives forever. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can give someone a second chance when they need it most, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to Soultales. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories about kindness, family, and second chances. The single dad's name was Daniel, and he had become very good at recognizing the things people tried to hide. At 38, Daniel worked long hours repairing commercial refrigeration units across the city. He was a father before anything else, and since his wife had passed away 3 years earlier, every decision he made revolved around his daughter, Lily. He had learned how quickly life could change. One ordinary morning could become the day everything you knew disappeared. Since then, Daniel had stopped judging people by what they wore, what they drove, or what they could afford. He had learned that sometimes the people carrying the heaviest burdens were the ones who smiled the most. That evening, he sat alone near the restaurant window, slowly eating a chicken dinner while rain tapped against the glass. The restaurant was warm and crowded, filled with families, couples, and people escaping the cold outside. Daniel barely noticed any of them until the mother and her daughter walked in. The woman looked exhausted. Her dark coat was damp from the rain, and one sleeve had been carefully stitched near the wrist. Her daughter wore a faded pink sweater, old sneakers, and a small backpack that looked almost too heavy for her narrow shoulders. They stood near the entrance for several seconds, scanning the menu. The mother looked at the prices. Then she looked at her daughter. Then back at the prices. The little girl smiled and pointed toward a picture of pancakes, but her mother gently lowered her hand. She whispered something into the girl's ear, and the child nodded. They walked to a small table near the corner and sat down. A waitress approached with menus. The mother opened hers, studied it carefully, and then closed it. She quietly asked for a glass of water for her daughter. The waitress looked slightly confused but brought it anyway. Daniel continued eating, but something about the scene bothered him. The mother kept checking the contents of her purse as though hoping money might somehow appear. Then the little girl looked toward Daniel's table. Her eyes stopped on his dinner. She stared at the chicken, the mashed potatoes, and the warm bread sitting beside his plate. She looked for only a second before quickly turning away. A moment later, she looked again. Daniel noticed. He lowered his fork. The mother noticed too. Her face changed instantly. Embarrassment crossed her expression, followed by something that looked painfully close to shame. She leaned toward her daughter and gently whispered something. The little girl nodded again, this time keeping her eyes on the table. The mother reached into her purse and pulled out a few crumpled bills and some coins. She counted them twice. Daniel could see that it wasn't enough for even the cheapest meal. A few minutes later, the woman stood up. She told her daughter it was time to go. The little girl looked confused but obeyed. She put her tiny backpack over her shoulders and followed her mother toward the door. As they passed Daniel's table, the little girl glanced at his plate one last time. That glance broke something inside him. Daniel remembered Lily at 4 years old, sitting at the kitchen table after he had lost his first job following his wife's death. He remembered pretending he wasn't worried about money while secretly counting the bills in his wallet. He remembered Lily asking whether they could have ice cream, and him smiling while knowing he couldn't afford it. He remembered what it felt like to be a father who wanted to give his child everything and sometimes couldn't even give her enough. Daniel stood. He picked up his plate. Then he walked toward the mother and daughter. The woman froze when she saw him approaching. She immediately looked defensive, as if expecting judgment. Daniel understood that reaction. He had seen it before. Poverty didn't just take money from people. Sometimes it took away their confidence, their ability to ask for help, and even their belief that they deserved kindness. Daniel didn't ask why they couldn't afford dinner. He didn't ask where the girl's father was. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply placed his dinner on their table and told them that he had ordered too much and wouldn't be able to finish it. The mother stared at him. She knew he was lying. Daniel knew she knew. But sometimes a kind lie was easier to accept than an act of charity. The little girl looked at the food, then at her mother. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Finally, the mother sat down. The little girl picked up the bread first. She took one tiny bite, then another. Soon her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to hide them. Daniel returned to his table and sat down with nothing in front of him. He expected them to eat and leave. Instead, the mother eventually walked over to him. She thanked him quietly and explained that they had been having a difficult month. Her name was Emily, and the little girl was her daughter, Sophie. Emily had recently lost her job at a small clothing store after the store closed unexpectedly. She had been searching for work ever since. Their rent was overdue, their electricity had been shut off twice, and she had been stretching every dollar until there were no more dollars left to stretch. Daniel listened without interrupting. She tried to leave the restaurant, but a single dad saw her little girl staring at his dinner. Then Emily said something that stayed with him. She said she had brought Sophie to the restaurant because she had promised her that they would have a proper dinner after a long day of walking around the city looking for work. When she realized she didn't have enough money, she had decided they would leave before Sophie became too disappointed. Daniel looked toward Sophie. The little girl was carefully dividing the remaining bread into 2 pieces. One piece for herself. One piece for her mother. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had seen hungry children before. But Sophie wasn't thinking only about herself. Even after receiving a meal she desperately wanted, she was still making sure her mother had something too. That night, Daniel paid for their dinner. But he didn't stop there. Before leaving, he gave Emily the contact information of a company he knew was hiring administrative staff. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't charity. It was simply an opportunity. Emily thanked him, but Daniel told her that if she wanted a second chance, she shouldn't be afraid to take one when someone opened a door. The next morning, Emily called the number. 3 days later, she got an interview. A week later, she got a job. It wasn't a glamorous job. It wasn't the kind of position that suddenly solved every problem. But it was steady work, decent pay, and most importantly, it gave Emily a way to start rebuilding her life. Daniel thought that would be the end of their story. It wasn't. A few months later, Daniel was repairing a broken refrigerator at a local community center when he heard a familiar voice behind him. He turned around. It was Sophie. She was holding a small paper bag. Emily stood behind her, smiling. Sophie walked toward Daniel and handed him the bag. Inside was a homemade sandwich and a handwritten note. Daniel unfolded the paper. The handwriting was uneven, with large letters and several misspelled words. It said that the first time they met, he had given Sophie dinner when she was hungry. Now she wanted to make sure he had lunch because she thought he might be hungry too. Daniel looked away for a moment. He didn't want them to see his eyes filling with tears. Emily explained that things were finally getting better. They had moved into a smaller but safe apartment. The electricity stayed on. Sophie had new school shoes. Emily had even started saving a little money every week. But she said there was something else. Sophie had started carrying extra snacks in her backpack. Whenever she saw another child who looked hungry, she shared one. Daniel smiled. He told her that kindness was something that grew when you passed it forward. Years passed. Daniel's daughter Lily eventually became close friends with Sophie. Emily remained in their lives, and the four of them sometimes had dinner together. What started as one unfinished plate of food slowly became a friendship that none of them had expected. But Daniel never forgot that first night. Because he had thought he was the one helping a hungry child. He later realized the little girl had given him something too. She had reminded him that after losing his wife, after struggling to raise his daughter, and after spending years believing he had to be strong all the time, his heart was still capable of being touched by a stranger. Sometimes we imagine that changing someone's life requires money, power, or a grand gesture. But sometimes it requires nothing more than noticing. Noticing the child who is trying not to stare. Noticing the mother who is counting coins. Noticing the person who is quietly walking away because they're too embarrassed to admit they need help. Daniel could have looked down at his plate and ignored them. Instead, he looked up. And that small decision became a turning point. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to Soultales. Sometimes a simple story can remind us of something the world makes us forget. We never truly know what someone else is going through. And before we reach the ending, I want to ask you for one special thing. Comment, "Kindness matters," below if you believe one small act of kindness can change someone's life. Years later, Sophie would sometimes tell people about the night a stranger gave her dinner. But Daniel always corrected her. He wasn't a stranger, he would say. He was simply a father who recognized another fatherless struggle in a little girl's eyes. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. You don't need to know someone's entire story to be kind to them. You don't need to understand their pain before you offer them dignity. Sometimes, all it takes is noticing. A plate of food. A little courage. And a heart willing to say, without making anyone feel ashamed, you don't have to leave hungry. Because somewhere tonight, there may be a mother counting coins. Somewhere, there may be a child pretending not to be hungry. And somewhere, there may be someone sitting at a table with enough to share. The question is not always whether we have enough. Sometimes the question is whether we are willing to notice who needs it.